Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to talk to you today in this section of the Diplomado. Sabah kindly invited me to contribute a session on evaluating resilience in port city regions, and to do so through a study that we've done on London, Hamburg, and Philadelphia. I understand that most of you come from a port or a city background. What is important for me to point out in region. So how does this territory evolve? What kind of spaces are shared? What do we need to do to address the shared challenges that these areas are facing? Sea level rise, changing water patterns, migration, digitization are all elements that cannot be handled just by a port, just by a city, or by a region. Spatially, socially, culturally, they are closely interrelated. So what I would like to look at are a couple of things that are part of research I've recently published. These are all open access texts, so you can go back and look at them. I believe that Sabah has shared with you the first two texts, but you will also, if you're interested, be able to look up more information on the three other texts. Now, the most important thing to start with is that ports and cities have a lot of spatial, social, and cultural overlap. Historically, they looked something like this. The city of Amsterdam, for example, ships went right into the heart of the city. Buildings accommodated the goods on one side. They had the warehouses towards the river. They had administrative functions, living functions directly on the street. Now, that kind of close integration of port and city has disappeared. But nonetheless, the port-city interaction, I would argue, has developed a particularly resilient structure, because the main actors in the port, the main actors in the city, have continued to work closely together. Their collaboration is often embedded in legal structures and policy making. And if port and city want to develop solutions for future challenges, they again need to do this together to address these changes. So what I would like to look at now is from the contemporary port. Here you see the port of Rotterdam, which has evolved from a location of the port city in the beginning to the biggest port of Europe, stretching all the long of the river, and with the port developing towards the sea and the city government following behind. Now, how can we understand these kinds of contemporary ports, make sense of them, and find the best options for future development? There are lots of studies out there that look at the port-city interface. And it's certainly important to look at the area where the land use of the port meets the city, where port functions start to disappear, leaving historical ports open for port areas open for development. And that has been discussed quite extensively in the field of waterfront studies. Now, these waterfront studies, the story of the interface, beautifully captured by Hoyle and many other people, as you can see here, has lots of benefits, but I think it also has some shortcomings. Notably, if we look at these selections, we look at port and city as a relation, as an interface, as a line that is between them. But I would argue that most of the time, port and city are interconnected spatially much more deeply than just along a line. So the way that I've been trying to visualize and understand the relation between port and city is captured in this image, which I call the port-city scape. So we need to look, in my mind, from the sea to the hinterland to really understand what's going on. The ships, their growth, their new technologies, their changes, containerization will influence the way the port looks. Drilling platforms, pipelines, all of this influences the design of the port, the different physical structures that are needed, the size of docks of different types of ports, also shapes the type and the form of the warehousing that is in the port or in the city area. But this is not limited to the pure area of the port itself. It actually extends into the city itself, the headquarters. Those are the places where the shipping is being administrated, where the design of the port is being created, and where decisions are made to see at what speed and what investments should be occurring. But even then, it goes, or this spatial development of the port goes much further. It also includes housing, the housing for the traders, the housing for the shippers, but also the housing for the workers. The infrastructures, how easily can the people working in the port reach the port, or how easily can the goods coming from the port be shipped to the hinterland? The location of retail is an important one. And if you think today about the story about the last mile, how do we get the goods from the huge ships and the containers into the city to the people who are actually going to use them? So waterfront redevelopment becomes one part, but the whole development of the hinterland is another important part. And for me, this port cityscape shown up here demonstrates the spatial parts of port city region interaction, all of which we have to look at, not just the interface. And these are reflected further through the way that we're actually looking at them. So how are they represented? What types of the port, what elements, what spaces of the port are actually seen, be it in newspapers, be it in advertisements, be it in art and architecture. And often what we see is that there are only specific parts of the ports that make it into the minds of the people. So when you ask people on the street, like AIVP, for example, did, you will find that people today still believe that there's men with bags, huge bags on their back, carrying things in the port. And many people don't have an understanding of how a contemporary port is actually working. So it is very important in my mind that we work on this mindset, that people understand what the role of the port is today, how it functions, so that even in their lifestyle choices, in their job selection, they can work creatively for the port. And that's not only limited to those people with clearly defined port jobs, but even architects or planners and others who can creatively use a maritime mindset to invest in imagining, developing the port of the future. And there's another component to this, I would argue, which is all about maritime languages, behaviors, but I'm not really getting into that. So to just give you one more example of how much port-city relationships can go beyond the interface, I think the example of Bruges or Brugge in Belgium is a nice one. It's often called a dead city. The water withdrew from the city, leaving it without access to the sea. However, the city managed to expand towards the coast, build a new port on the new coastline, which is the port of Seebrugge today. So there is no one spatial fixity. Even the spaces can change as access to water, for example, evolves. And so in the case of Brugge, a new port was built in 1907. And I think this is one of the images I was talking about, how the relation between port and city, the relation between land and water is actually can celebrated through paintings, through imaginaries. And those are the things that stick with the inhabitants, that will inspire them to support a particular policy, a particular approach that is being promoted by the city government or by the port government. And in the end, the port city leaders will need this kind of support from their populations to move ahead with their own policies, with their goals for port and city development. So just to make the point again, the port alone will not be able, or only up to a certain point, be able to pursue its own policies. It needs the support of the city and its citizens. And the same thing is, the city alone cannot only implement its policies against the port or against the citizens. So that is, for me, the important message that I'm trying to convey, that a resilient port city region needs the collaboration, needs shared values for the share of this particular area. So let's look at London, Hamburg, and Rotterdam. Each of these has had a very different history of interaction between port and city actors. London, I would call a global city with an outplaced port. It has had private-led port city development for a long time. And one could even argue that the national government only intervened or interfered whenever it became absolutely necessary. So the River Thames had crowded conditions, ships were sitting side by side, there were various groups in the city controlling, for example, the legal case. But as the city was growing, as the empire, the British Empire was growing, there was not enough space to really take care of all the cargo. So private groups came together to create dock companies, building docks like the St. Catherine's dock, where the ships could be brought into a reserved area, discharging directly into their warehouses. With docks being used, it meant that ships had to wait for the right height of the water to be able to get in and out of these docks. Now, this intervention in London meant that entire neighborhoods were being emptied, buildings destroyed, so that this could be built. The importance of the private development was strong enough to let this intervention go and happen. Now, throughout the 19th century into the 20th century, we will then see the construction of multiple docks, the famous docklands alongside the River Thames. And this is a private development that moves away from the city center towards the outskirts. And as soon as the port needs new development areas, we will see the port moving even further outside of the city, beyond the city boundaries, into the area of Tilbury. So this spatial decoupling is occurring, and public planning intervenes only when it is absolutely necessary. So strikes by the dockers will lead to opposition to the private organization, and we will see the construction of the London Port Authority, which will then set up this gorgeous building in the center of the city. So at that time, around 1910, we see an emergence of national intervention, the creation of a port authority, creation of control in order to facilitate, in the end, the privately run development of the port. So the city itself, you could think, as the port runs away, loses its power and loses its prominence. Yes, but the city also manages to recapture the old port spaces. Interestingly, and this is typical for the London Docklands, the old port function, the access to the water, becomes a kind of decorative element. It stays there, but in fact, this area becomes an extension of the needs of the city, and the decoupling of the port, which has moved out of the city, and the role of control and the administration that is in the city center of London become really separated from one another. Now, so in the end, we see that in the case of London, so in the case of Hamburg, we say a very different development. We have a harbor which remains in town and under municipal leadership for many centuries. Hamburg is also an old port city with a tidal port. So instead of, while it has been looking at London as an inspiration, the city leaders quickly realized that the case of the London docks was not appropriate for the Hamburg case, where the tides were much higher. So they opted for a tidal port and built within the city a monofunctional port, a warehouse district, and an office district. But the city had started more or less in the same place as London, with multiple ships on the river, with access to the houses, multifunctional houses that had warehouse function, administrative functions, and housing all in the same place. Now, that what was particular for Hamburg is that while the city was implementing all these major changes, they would acknowledge the needs of the workers for housing and for travel to the port. So while we also see hardship in the city, cholera, diseases, slums, and all of these troubles, workers' strikes is the same. We also see an attempt to maintain social cohesion through the implementation of different measures. So Hamburg is quite famous for the construction of the so-called Speicherstadt, the warehouse district, which was a monofunctional district built next to the tidal port that we see here, where all the goods from overseas were being stored. The area had been built at the moment when Hamburg joined the German Empire and received funding from Germany. A whole zone of some 20,000 people was cleaned in order to be able to implement this monofunctional district. Now, the function of this district was cutting edge. So you see here the ships being unloaded. There were sheds here, direct access to the railway stations, the railway lines, storage in these new warehouse buildings, access to the warehouse buildings for smaller ships from the back end, and then the whole was surrounded and separated from the city, accessible to further bridges, and then the city next to it. Now, this new construction of this monofunctional warehouse district also required a new form of administration. So we have here the tidal port that I just showed you, with the warehouse district in this area, and the construction of a new area for administration right next to the port. While the administration is growing and the warehouse district are growing to the north of the river, most of the harbor will expand to the south of the river. So in this emergence of these monofunctional districts, after the warehouse district, we see the construction of new office buildings, and the world famous Chile House is one of them. So that's a nice greeting to all of you. The Chile House was named after the guano, or was funded by a trader who thrived off the sales of guano for the agricultural areas at the time. This was after World War I in the 1920s. There was very little money around. And so with the money brought in from the outside trade, they were able to build this building, hence also the name. And its particular architectural form, this ship-like character, has made it very famous. It has appeared on stamps and postcards and in books and magazines, and has really become an icon of Hamburg as a port city, and has become a vehicle to promoting the city as a port city state. And this idea, this celebration of Hamburg as a port city, is also very clear in the city-led innovation on the waterfront. So in contrast to London, Hamburg has implemented in the abandoned port areas. So by now this Speicherstadt area, this warehouse district, is abandoned. The port has jumped over the river, mostly to the south. This area is now part of the city, is being extended into a multifunctional district with high-end houses, but also community, corporate houses with office buildings, and also local schools. So it's a really mixed functional district with its iconic opera house, the Philharmonie, visible here in the background. So Hamburg has managed to both implement a new type of port, keeping the port within the city, making it usable for the city, redeveloping the historic port into a modern district, and creating a mindset that binds the port and the city closely together. And I think that is one of the strengths that Hamburg stands for, in being able to combine all of this and thus having the port and the city evolve as a tandem together. This is very different from the third case that we're going to discuss, Philadelphia, where the port bears the future. Now keep in mind that Philadelphia has also a very long old port city history. The city was built actually as having two ports, one on the Schuylkill River, a river port, and the other on the Delaware, which is for the ocean-going ships. Philadelphia was designed after the fire of London to avoid all the pitfalls and the shortcomings of the British capital. So it was to be orderly, it was to be less affected by diseases like cholera or fire. It was really a city designed to host a port. It was the first capital of the United States, and it also actually hosted a military port. Now, this story has gone on for a long time. Philadelphia in the late 19th century became the main export hub for oil from the United States. 50% of the oil of the US were shipped out from Philadelphia. The city had, until a couple of months ago, the longest running refinery in the world. Having this kind of industrial facilities in a port often means that the flows of these commodities, flows of oil, are being brought through the entire country into Philadelphia, in this case, keeping the refineries running and functioning. And that is one of the troubles or the dangers of having these ports, because their existence will attract other flows. The existence of industries like oil will attract new flows. And so the existing spatial structure will continue to reinforce the urban development and in fact help or inspire the decisions of the future. In the case of Philadelphia, we really see a lack of municipal engagement. And this lack of municipal engagement is true both for the port itself. Starting from 1910, the port will stop dredging the river, they will stop investing in the port, but also in the redevelopment of the waterfront. So whereas in London, we have this investment into a corporate district on the historic waterfront, in Hamburg, we have a multifunctional, broadly based transformation of the former port areas. In Philadelphia, we see a piecemeal intervention where each developer will do something different with their specific site. There had been a vision to do a comprehensive development together with Camden. Camden is the city opposite from Philadelphia on the Delaware River, where an aquarium and other elements were built typical of waterfront redevelopment. And the idea was to have a shared development on both sides of the river. But in the case of Philadelphia, despite it having all kinds of visionary projects for the waterfront, little has happened. And the latest moment where such a comprehensive development could have been possible, and this is also a topic that merits way more research, is the redevelopment of the former Navy Yard. So as the military left the port of Philadelphia, large areas became available for redevelopment. However, these areas are often only accessible through one single line. Now, if you want to make them truly a part of the city, there need to be more crossings into this area. So far, the redevelopment has not been, well, I would say very successful, in the sense that it has become more of a suburban addition to the city, a separate area, rather than a fully integrated part of the city. So in the case of Philadelphia, we see that the port function becomes separated from the city. Local stakeholders from the beginning of the 20th century find other interests. They don't support the port function anymore. For example, the University of Sofia becomes the main, provides most of the jobs in the city. So there's little support for the port. The port starts to almost disappear, with city functions taking the lead in the development of the city. Now, every case that I've shown you has a different relationship between port and city actors. Each of these examples has different spaces dedicated to port or city and the region. It has different governance structures. Now, each of them responds to the same global developments, let's say containerization, for example. But each of them has to find local solutions. Now, in the beginning, I talked about the interface model, but the reality of these cities is much more complex. And so what I think we ought to be looking at is a more space-based analysis of port city regions, and an analysis that allows us to find the gaps, the opportunities, the challenges between the different moves, the different times, the different spaces of port and city. So what we are trying to develop right now is an approach that allows us to look through the different times, through the eras. So let's say here from 1300 to 2020, we see the development of the port through time. And we see the development of the port through different scales. Now, right now, we've been working on this diagonal perspective approach to see, as the port and city grow, how does the overall region transform? And here I'm giving you the example of Rotterdam, but we've also been doing this for Hamburg and London, as you can see here. So in those three cases, in Rotterdam, we see a city that has grown and is starting to thrive based on the port. The port is the one in the pair that actually leads the development as the port expands, and we see it here growing towards the west. The city follows its development. And so innovation often comes first from the port and is then being picked up by the city. We've discussed the case of Hamburg, where the port is an integral part of the city development, and you can see it here grow. In this case, this is the city of Hamburg, this is the city of Altona. This is actually a separate port. There's a third separate port down here. In 1937, these ports will all become part of the greater Hamburg with an integrated port. And until today, you can see that both of them grow together, and that's important too, because Hamburg is a city-state where the governance is actually expanded over this entire region. In the case of London, as we saw, the port gets pushed out of the city, or rather it decides to move outside the city, develop outside the city, as far outside as here as Tilbury, in order not to be bothered by the spatial, social, and cultural constraints of the city itself, leaving the central areas over for redevelopment. So as we zoom in on this close local level, we actually see that the relationship between port, city, and region, the spatial, the social, the cultural relationships, vary from one place to another. And I think there's lots of opportunities as we recognize what the particularities of each place are. There are opportunities to think about new creative solutions for a local port, for the local city, and for the relationship between the two of them. So I've already shown you here the case of Rotterdam, for example, and it gives you better insight on what we are trying to map: water and land areas, land use areas. And this is the first step towards developing a spatial tool that shows us more than just a single interface, but really shows us how different layers of space, governance, culture are intersecting. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to receiving your questions. Thank you. Bye-bye.